Our speaker today is John Schneider. John's interest in radio began at San Francisco State in 1969. There he conducted a special research project on radio broadcast history. He continued this pursuit throughout his professional career in radio broadcast electronics, where he retired after 45 years in the field. He's also the author of the book Bay Area Radio. In addition to his books and articles, John also maintains a broadcasting history website. It's www.theradiohistorian.org, and there he publishes an annual broadcasting history calendar. Welcome, John Schneider. The floor is all yours.
Okay, the virtual floor, I guess. Everybody can hear me okay? What I'm going to talk about today is radio station KGEI, which began its operations on Treasure Island, and from that I'll expand into San Francisco's larger role in shortwave radio broadcasting during the Second World War. The story all began with General Electric in Schenectady, New York, which was a company that really developed much of the early radio transmitter and receiver technology. They were a hotbed of research into the development of radio transmission and radio broadcasting in the 20s and 30s. They started a Schenectady radio station, WGY, and in 1926 they built this large facility outside of Schenectady to test new radio transmission techniques. And one of their interests was in developing the possibilities for broadcasting on shortwave frequencies. And when I say shortwave, broadcasting began in 1920 on what is today's conventional AM or medium wave band, 540 to 1600 kilohertz, the old band on your car radio. But there was experimental interest at the time also in the shortwave frequencies. Amateur radio operators discovered that on shortwaves, radio signals traveled much farther and with much less power. So there was interest in seeing if it works for amateur radio, how does this work for radio broadcasting? Signals could travel around the globe, and that would open up for the first time the possibility of broadcasting not just in a regional area, but on a worldwide basis. So in 1926, General Electric opened up experimental stations 2XAF and 2XK in Schenectady, and they were basically rebroadcasting the programs of the AM station WGY. And these were later consolidated into two stations, W2XAD and W2XAF, in Schenectady. And then very shortly they started to, instead of just rebroadcasting AM station programs, started to do their own programs, specialized programs that were transmitted to other countries, principally South America and Europe, which were the ranges of those stations. Here we see an Indian announcer broadcasting in the ancient Sanskrit language. And then also in Schenectady, they held a radio bridge game where a team in Australia competed against a team in South America with everything broadcast over the air. So there were interesting experiments and just fun, novel ideas of what you can do with international broadcasting. These stations in 1940 became commercial broadcasting stations, shortwave stations WGEA and WGEO in Schenectady. So General Electric also had opened broadcasting in the Bay Area in the 20s. They were the company that started station KGO, but later had turned that over to NBC. And so in the late 30s, General Electric had no broadcasting presence outside of Schenectady. They decided that they needed to get back into it, and specifically in the shortwave bands, and they decided that the opportunity to do this would be the Golden Gate International Exposition. So plans were made to construct a station, and the station would be located on the fairgrounds at Treasure Island. The station at the time when it opened in 1939 was called W6XBE, and it was located in the Palace of Electricity and Communications at the fairgrounds with the antenna on the roof of the building. So these are a couple of pictures of the large building, the Palace of Electricity and Communications, which had displays by a number of commercial companies showing their wares in advancing technology. This is a colorized image of the W6XBE installation at the fair, where visitors to the fair could see an operating shortwave transmitter and through the windows watch the broadcast operations as programs were transmitted to South America and to the Pacific. It actually was part of the larger General Electric exposition, which you can see in the background in this picture. One of the other major parts of that exhibition was called the House of Magic. It had a modern house with a magic kitchen that moved and talked. So people could come through and see various aspects of what General Electric was doing in the advancement of technology for the future, both in radio and home electronics and technology. So this is a photograph that recently was rediscovered, showing one of the two antennas that was up on the roof of the building. This is what launched the signals of W6XBE during the exhibition. On September of 1939, the government decided that shortwave stations would no longer be experimental, and they were relicensed as commercial stations. And so W6XBE took on broadcasting call letters KGEI, which stood for General Electric International. Inside, if you were to look through the windows of the exhibit in the studios and control rooms, these are some pictures of what you might see. Announcers broadcasting in both English and Spanish with programs principally aimed at Latin America every afternoon from 3 to 7:30. There were also broadcasts to Asia, but they were taking place in the middle of the night, San Francisco time, so there was not anything for fairgoers to see of that. Here's yet another view showing the full installation with the transmitter to the right and the control room and studio and the public waiting for programs to begin on the shortwave station. This is another part of the exhibit. It showed that there was a General Electric console radio, a map showing the coverage paths of the station, and a teletype that delivered news service from the International News Service, which were the news programs broadcast over KGEI. Buck Harris was the station manager who worked for General Electric for the duration of the fair, running the station operations, as he's seen here interviewing the president of IBM in 1939. There were other people on the staff. Juan Trasvina and Carlos Benedetti were the Spanish language announcers. Norman Page was an English language announcer, and Bert Scholes, the chief engineer of the station. Celebrities, when they would visit the fair, were often invited to appear for interviews or special programs on KGEI. In this case, Cesar Romero and Sally Eilers, actors visiting from Hollywood, had a chance to broadcast over the station. So, combining its two operations, General Electric's plan was to cover the world on shortwave, both from Schenectady and San Francisco, and it was a service that they promoted as an advancement in technology, an advancement in broadcasting, and development of worldwide broadcasting, even though nobody had ever really figured out how you make money with shortwave broadcasting. So this was all done basically as a public service by the station. So that operation continued for 2 years until the fair closed in September of 1940. But KGEI did not go away at that point. They moved their studios and offices into the Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill, where new studio operations were constructed. and the broadcast continued after the fair from this location. The transmitter was relocated to the Belmont Salt Flats. NBC operated a transmitter there for radio station KPO, which is now KNBR, and that operation still exists at this site. And so NBC invited them to build their shortwave operation next to their AM transmitter facility. So this photo shows the General Electric transmitting building and the towers of the shortwave operation. The power was increased from 20,000 watts to 50,000 watts at this time with the installation of a new, more powerful transmitter and more powerful antenna. This is the transmitter that was installed after the fair at KGEI in Belmont. This was the new transmitter building. It was designed to survive bomb attacks, so the walls were 3-foot thick reinforced concrete. The building was designed to last for hundreds of years. Here is the towers of the new shortwave antenna that were installed on the Salt Flats, and this map shows what the coverage area was. It looks like two downward facing lobes, but actually if you do this on a great circle map on a globe, you see that it transmits to two sides of the antenna at 180 degrees. So putting this in the political context of 1940 and 1941, the Pacifics, rather than Latin America, increasingly becomes of interest to a number of parties. Japan is increasing its presence, and threats of independent governments in the Pacific. The nationalists in Japan are demanding that there is territorial expansion to gain raw materials. In the early 30s, they invaded Manchuria, and in 1937, Japan invaded eastern China. The United States imposed economic sanctions against Japan, but took no military action. And that was the situation that KGEI was broadcasting into in the Pacific at the time. KGEI actually had no news staff. It broadcast news read directly from the INS teletype news service. INS was owned by William Randolph Hearst, and he was an isolationist. And so all of the news that the INS was transmitting to KGEI was slanted towards an isolationist position. The result was that Pacific listeners to KGEI, including the Japanese military, believed that it was the official position of the United States government, not understanding independent broadcasting. And so they believed that the hidden message is that if a Pacific War was started, the U.S. would not intervene. So the situation for shortwave broadcasting in the United States at that time was that everything was commercial and in private hands. In fact, Congress had prohibited the government from doing any shortwave broadcasting because they did not want the government passing its official messages to the rest of the world via shortwave broadcasting. This was an obstacle to FDR, as he wanted to send a clear message of the U.S. position to Japan and the Pacific via broadcasting, but he had no direct way of doing that. So in July of 1941, the Roosevelt government formed the Coordinator of Information to centralize government intelligence. Its head was William Wild Bill Donovan. And they decided that they wanted to see if they could tweak KGEI's programming and message because it was the only American signal that was being heard in the Pacific. They pressured GE to say, we want your message to be more pro-government and more of the message that we want you to deliver. We can't order you to transmit things, but we can recommend them. So based on this, KGEI changed its slogan to the Voice of Freedom and hired a news commentator named William Winter, who was at the time working for KSFO, to be its first news voice at the government request. Winter would show up at the KGEI studios in the Fairmont Hotel at 6 in the morning and broadcast a news bulletin, which was being heard in the Pacific in the late afternoon. And then after he was done at KGEI, he would go over to KSFO and broadcast news for the noon broadcast. The coordinator of information installed a private teletype just for William Winter in a locked room in the KGEI studios. Only Winter had the key, and they would collect and send him what they called suggested materials for broadcast. And he was free to pick and choose from among that information and transmit that information as part of his news program. So he broadcast two English news commentaries per day into the Pacific. And that was the KGEI situation immediately prior to Pearl Harbor. But of course, once Pearl Harbor happened, that changed everything. And the government needed to be much more active and forceful in its broadcasting to the Pacific. However, at that time, they were at a big disadvantage, both in terms of broadcast to the Pacific and Europe. Japan had dozens of shortwave signals. Germany had some 40 transmitters. The United States had only 10 stations, and all of them were in private hands. These stations in a total broadcast only 35 hours a day of programming, and mostly what they were doing is rebroadcasting NBC and CBS network programs into South America. And all of these stations were in the East Coast except for KGEI. So they favored Europe and South America, but not the Pacific. Also in 1941, the coordinator of information had formed the Foreign Information Service to broadcast news and propaganda. They put playwright Robert Sherwood in charge of that broadcasting arm of the COI. Sherwood at the time was the speechwriter for FDR. Also at the time, right after the beginning of the war, they formed the Office of War Information in June of 1942, and its purpose was specifically to broadcast and print information to be transmitted externally during the course of the war. CBS news commentator Elmer Davis was hired to be the first head of the OWI, and the OWI eventually was transformed into what is today the Voice of America. Another interesting side note is actor John Houseman was hired to be the head of radio programming for the Foreign Information Service in New York. Large studios were set up in New York for broadcasting war news and information into Europe, but those programs did not go to the Pacific. The prohibition against government shortwave broadcasting is still in effect, so the OWI decided that they would lease all private shortwave broadcasting stations. If we can't own and operate them, we will lease them. Because of the wartime conditions, the prohibition of shortwave broadcasting was, as I said, was still in effect, but basically the law, as far as the programming aspect was concerned, was ignored. This was a fast-track way for the government to start getting its voice heard outside the U.S. on these 10 radio stations. KGEI is the only shortwave station on the West Coast, and it covers the Pacific very well. The other 9 stations really cannot be heard at all in the Pacific. So it becomes the essential West Coast voice of the Office of War Information. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese bombed Manila. The American forces that were in the Philippines retreated to Bataan and Corregidor Island. On Corregidor Island, General MacArthur is listening each day to William Winter's broadcasts over KGEI, and he sends communiques to Winter, which are all read over the air on KGEI. So the station becomes General MacArthur's voice to the people of the Pacific. Most of those communiques are just an unrealistic promise of an impossible victory, as the Japanese really have complete control at that point in the Philippines. The U.S. forces were able to take possession of a Manila AM transmitter, and they moved it and reassembled it as a temporary station in Bataan, which they called Freedom Radio. And its purpose was essentially to relay the broadcast being received on shortwave over KGEI onto the AM band for the local population. And that station operated from February until the Japanese took possession of Bataan and the rest, that extreme end of the Philippines, in May of 1942. Well, now that the war is underway, most of KGEI's programs are no longer being aimed at Latin America. They're being programmed to the Far East, to both our soldiers, our allies, and our enemies. And these are different examples of programs that were being transmitted. Musicians from Chinatown would come in and perform for the Chinese audience. An American missionary preacher who had been previously preaching in Japanese broadcast missionary programs in Japanese to the Japanese people. And for the soldiers, the wives of soldiers who were stationed in the Pacific were brought in to transmit messages over the air to their husbands fighting in the Pacific in a program that was called the Radio Mailbag. So there was a continuous parade of family members of soldiers that were brought in. Also, KGEI was doing news in Tagalog and discussion program in English, a regular program called Freedom for the Philippines. So much of the programming was really aimed at the occupied Philippine Islands. William Winter left KGEI in 1942 when actually he traveled into the Far East and became a foreign war correspondent for the INS and other news organizations. But KGEI continued to be the important voice into the Pacific. This article from March of 1942 in Time magazine explained that the programs were being received and listened to widely every afternoon in the Pacific. Broadcasts that started at 2 a.m. in San Francisco. In March of 1942, General MacArthur evacuated the Philippines and went to Australia. He broadcast his famous "I Will Return" communique, and that recorded broadcast was transmitted by KGEI and heard by the people in the Philippines. But KGEI reception in the Pacific was becoming increasingly difficult. The Japanese had set up jamming transmitters on the station's frequency to block the broadcasts and cause interference in some of the areas. So it was clear that it was a battle for who can have more transmitters, the Americans transmitting their messages or the Japanese jamming the messages. One of the first broadcasters to offer help was Wesley Dumm, who was the owner of KSFO in San Francisco. He was invited by FDR to participate in a planning meeting in August of 1941. It was an emergency meeting in Washington to plan for the construction of new shortwave stations. FDR and Wild Bill Donovan invited government broadcasting licensees and equipment manufacturers all to talk about how can we build up our shortwave broadcasting into Europe and the Pacific. At that meeting, CBS, NBC, Crosley Broadcasting in Cincinnati, and KSFO committed to put 32 new shortwave transmitters on the air within 1 year, to be funded in some way by the government. I corresponded and met with Wesley Dumm in 1971, and he said he attended this meeting, which was also attended by representatives of Great Britain and Australia. During the meeting, not only was the first meeting organized for the birth of the Voice of America, but also President Roosevelt asked me if I would build 2 shortwave stations in San Francisco to serve the Far East. Roosevelt said, I don't have the money to give you to do this, but I promise I'll find the money in the future to reimburse you your investments. So all of this initially was done as an out-of-pocket expense by KSFO and the associated broadcasters. At the time, KSFO operated and still transmits from this building at Ilay Creek on the bay shore of southeast San Francisco. So it was decided this would be the new home of shortwave station KWID. It needed to be a big, powerful signal, and at that moment, the biggest transmitter in the United States was at General Electric station WGEO in Schenectady. It was 100,000 watts, and the transmitter was called Big Bertha. And GE agreed to disassemble that transmitter and ship it to San Francisco, where, because of the large distances over the Pacific, the highest power signal was required for there instead of for transmission to Europe. So an addition was built. Just in the course of 5 months, an entire shortwave station was assembled in San Francisco. That area happened to be sparsely populated still at that time, which is hard to believe seeing the city of San Francisco today. But this is a view of the 11 acres that adjoined the KSFO transmitter building and the beginnings of the first antenna that was installed next to the transmitter site for the transmission of KWID. With a high-powered transmitter and this big antenna, it had a radiated power of 10 million watts, making KWID the world's most powerful shortwave station. So this is a picture of Big Bertha being reassembled in the KSFO building. And by May of 1942, the installation was complete, and KWID was ready to begin broadcasting just 5 months after Pearl Harbor. This is a picture of some of the staff and dignitaries in the expanded building for KSFO and KWID. Here's a later, very poor quality photograph, but it shows what that installation finally looked like towards the end of the war, when the 11 acres was full of shortwave antennas aimed for different parts of the Pacific that could be connected to transmitters at different times of the day to shotgun signals into different areas. KWID needed studios in the short term. They were shoehorned into the KSFO location on the 17th floor of the Mark Hopkins Hotel, but also promised funding by the OWI. New studios were constructed for KSFO and KWID on the backside of the Mark Hopkins Hotel, and that you can still see that building section today as with the address of number 1 Nob Hill Circle. That became an important broadcast location starting in World War II and actually running into the 1980s, with several San Francisco stations broadcasting from that building. So that was a very large broadcast complex. There were 9 studios in the building where programs could be broadcast on KWID and KSFO at the same time. Additional recordings made for playback at later time over shortwave, live studio broadcasts, military swing bands that would come in and record music for the soldiers to listen to overseas. It was a beehive of broadcast activity. Finally, in November of 1942, the government took formal control of all 14 shortwave transmitters that they had been leasing. All of the takeovers were friendly except for one station, WRUL, in Scituate, Massachusetts. And because the owners did not agree to do that, the government seized the station under wartime powers. So the owners continued to own the stations and were to operate the stations at no profit, with the government assuming all costs. All programming came from the Office of War Information Studios. The Army was assigned to guard these broadcast properties, as well as a number of key AM facilities around the country as essential national infrastructure. In San Francisco in 1942, NBC had moved out of its former broadcast studio facilities into the new Radio City building at Taylor and O'Farrell Streets. This became the San Francisco studios for KPO and KGO and the West Coast broadcasts of these two NBC networks. So the previous studios had been at 111 Sutter Street, and when NBC moved out, the Office of War Information moved in, and these became the new West Coast studios of the OWI. So all overseas broadcasts were coming from two locations, the OWI studios in New York City, and for the Pacific Coast, programs originated at 111 Sutter Street. So just in the course of a year, the expansion has taken place that the OWI is broadcasting 700 weekly programs, 24 hours a day 17 hours a day in 9 languages. The English programs are being broadcast live. Foreign language broadcasts are being transcribed, and then the transcriptions are being checked by censors to make sure that the foreign language messages are really what the government intended, and then the transcriptions are later broadcast at the appropriate hours. This is a picture of the New York City operation of the OWI. In 1943, money was appropriated for 22 new shortwave transmitters to add additional signals around the country. KWID received a second transmitter, a 50 kilowatt RCA, which is seen here, in 1943, and it broadcast on a separate frequency under the call sign KWIX. KGEI received a 100 kilowatt transmitter the next year, and it was assigned the call letters KGEX. So adding to the original 14 leased transmitters, the OWI is now being heard on 36 different frequencies all around the world. In addition, there were non-broadcast operations, communications transmitters that were being co-opted. RCA operated communications station KPH in Bolinas, which started relaying OWI programs under the call letters KRCA and KRCQ. NBC agreed to build a new shortwave facility, and a large property was acquired in the city of Dixon in the Central Valley. Those stations went on the air on December 27, 1944, with 4 different frequencies and 4 different sets of call signs. In addition, CBS built a powerful site in Delano with 3 signals going on the air in November 1944. So all through the course of the war, there's a continuous effort to build and operate shortwave broadcasting stations. And now, as the war is nearing its climax, we can see that there are transmitter locations all over California. This transmitter is still functioning today. It's at KPH in Bolinas, which is now a National Park Service volunteer-operated site. And it's believed that this transmitter was operating during the war as under the call letters KRCA, broadcasting more news to the Pacific. And it is now still operational and turned on from time to time. So by the time the war ends, here's a long list of broadcasting stations that are transmitting to the Pacific from the West Coast from different parts of California on different frequencies at different hours of the day. So what started out in the war as a small operation became a huge complex of broadcast programs and transmitters.
Hi, fellas. This is Jill again. And as usual, the old jukebox is here beside me. The AEF Jukebox of the Air. It's really seen a lot of service, but it's going as strong as ever, spinning those records out to all points. There's a record to count here, gang, and hear them you shall as Charlie Barnett sets things jumping with Skyliner.
So that's a very rare recording off the air from KGEI in 1944. By this time, the war is going well for the Americans, and so we have huge contingents of troops in the Pacific, and a lot of the programming is being shifted to entertainment for the troops. And that was one example of one of the programs that was being heard.
This is station KGEI, the Voice of America, San Francisco. KGEI, operated by the General Electric Company, now concludes its transmission on 15.13 megacycles in the 19-meter band, as authorized by the Federal Communications Commission.
So that's a little bit of what KGEI sounded like towards the end of World War II.
This is the voice of freedom, General MacArthur speaking. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two people.
So those are some short clips of entertainment and important war news that were broadcast over KGEI, KWID, and other stations. Finally, after VJ Day, the government has this huge shortwave operation, which they didn't have before the war. So what do we do with it? It's a return to peacetime, and the OWI becomes the Office of International Information.
This is the Voice of America, Washington, D.C., signing on.
So the operation is restructured as a peacetime operation and rechristened the Voice of America. Eventually, the VOA, formed as an official government organization, acquires the Delano and Dixon shortwave sites that were built by NBC and CBS, and they become large West Coast VOA operations, which operated for a number of years up until about the last decade. The VOA also acquired the Bethany, Ohio site from Crosley, and it built its own transmitter facilities in Greenville, North Carolina, and a couple of other locations. What had been private leased transmitters were turned over to the government because, after all, in the end, shortwave broadcasting never made any money as a commercial operation. So those companies were very happy to get out of the shortwave business. The shortwave stations KWID and KWIX were not taken over by the government, but they continued to be leased and operate as VOA relays for a few more years. But they finally ceased operations in 1953. And one of the reasons was that the powerful radio signals being transmitted were interfering with operations at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. So those shortwave operations closed down and were disassembled. But the operation of KGEI continued on. General Electric took the station back but decided not to close it, unlike KSFO's decision. And so they operated it as now renaming it from the Voice of Freedom to the Voice of Friendship. And it became a private broadcast operation. never making any money, really being operated as a public service. And it continued to operate through the 1950s. In 1959, General Electric sold KGEI to the Far East Broadcasting Company, which is a large Christian broadcasting organization that has radio stations all over the world. And they broadcast religious and cultural programs both to Latin America and the Far East, with a more powerful transmitter.
This is the voice of friendship, international broadcast station KGEI in San Francisco, California, the United States of America, beginning its broadcast schedule to the Far East. KGEI is owned and operated by the Far East Broadcasting Company and is dedicated to promoting goodwill, peace, and spiritual understanding among the peoples of the world.
So that's just a little snippet of what KGEI sounded like during the Far East Broadcasting Company period. And actually, most of the station's broadcasts at that time were aimed at South America. By the 1980s, government broadcasting on the shortwave bands is disappearing, especially after the end of the Cold War. Radio Moscow disappeared. The Voice of America started cutting back its operations. And little by little, the remaining use of the shortwave bands became religious broadcasting. But rising operating costs, reduced listenership, and increased interference caused many of these stations to shut down, especially after the introduction of the internet, which was a much easier and more efficient means of transmitting audio to other parts of the world. So the Far East Broadcasting Company decided to close KGEI in 1994. They moved equipment to some of its other stations. The original GE 50 kilowatt transmitter was donated to a station in Liberia, but it didn't broadcast for very long before it was destroyed by rebels who didn't like the station's messages. So that was the unfortunate end of an amazing broadcast operation, KGEI. Now, the interesting thing is the former KGEI building is now the headquarters of a wastewater treatment facility, the Silicon Valley Clean Water Organization. They recently restored the building and uncovered a section, a wood panel that had been installed over the front of the building for many years, and discovered the original call sign underneath that cover. So this is what the building looks like today, newly restored and looking like it did in the 1930s. So that's my very long-winded explanation of San Francisco's contribution to shortwave broadcasting in the war years and beyond, a story that all started there on Treasure Island. And so I'd like to thank Walt and Rain and the others in the museum for this opportunity to share this story, and I'll stay on for any questions that people might have.
Well, thanks, John. That was really fascinating, and really appreciate you doing that talk for us. Rain, there was a question from the chat.
So the first question is from Dana and Alan. And they wrote, the station that was transmitting 15-20 kW, was the ERP or the actual power from the transmitter's finals? Also, I noticed that the original station call sign was a 1x3 call sign. The 1x3 call sign was an amateur radio call sign. When did the FCC remove the state number, i.e. 6 for California? Hopefully that makes sense.
It all makes sense. Obviously, a question from a radio person. The 20,000 watt signal was the transmitter power, and that is amplified by the antenna to create what's called effective radiated power, which is much greater if the equivalent power transmitted to a particular location. But that 20,000 watts was the actual transmitter power. And in the 1930s, the government was assigning amateur radio style call letters to experimental stations. The difference was that the first letter after the zone number was an X. So the fact that it was W6XBE, X indicating experimental. And so even though it looks like an amateur radio call sign, it was not.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, John, for a really interesting talk about something I know very little about. But as a teenager in the 1970s, I can't remember how, but we got our hands on a radio that we hitched up to an antenna and listened to these kind of international shortwave broadcasts. I remember one from Russia, maybe it was Radio Moscow, I don't remember. But we were really amazed by this, that, you know, we had no idea there was such a technology. My thought listening to you give your presentation is, why did shortwave never take off as a commercial venture? It seemed, I remember listening to this and being pretty amused by it as a teenager in the 70s, but you know, if you said it didn't make any money, what was that all about?
Well, it didn't make any money because broadcasting, for the most part, survives on commercial messages, paid commercial messages, and it didn't seem to work very well to broadcasting. Advertising is targeted typically to a small segment of an audience that an advertiser wants to reach, and a broad brush transmission all over the world is not going to help a lot of potential advertisers. There are a few. Coca-Cola is drunk all over the world and obviously does a lot of just name brand advertising. So it works well for that, but it's not going to sell automobiles or furniture or appliances. And so it never generated much interest for commercial advertising. The function that shortwave was successful at was the transmission of government propaganda and religion. And so those were the two fields of programs that sustained shortwave broadcasting for many decades. During the government propaganda period of the Cold War, there were huge, powerful shortwave stations all over the world broadcasting massive signals, massive amounts of power. They were very expensive operations to run. Governments can support that. Private operations cannot. And so those operations were one by one disassembled, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. A lot of the signals that, for those who are familiar with shortwave broadcasting, used to listen to, such as the BBC, the Voice of America, HCJB in Ecuador, Radio Nederland, they have all been dismantled as the government no longer saw the point of spending money on huge plants with big staffs and giant power bills to transmit to a decreasing number of people with messages that were less and less important. So most of the Voice of America has moved its operation now mostly to the internet and to rebroadcasting through local stations, but there are still some government Voice of America shortwave operations. They continue to broadcast to Africa, and Radio Marti continues to broadcast to Cuba. Those are the two shortwave operations that the U.S. government continues to operate. But yeah, it was a fantastic technology whose time came and for the most part has been supplanted by more modern and more efficient technologies, like a lot of other things in the world.
Okay, thanks, John. Lisa Rubens, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I want to piggyback a little bit on the last question. Firstly, I just want to say it was a terrific talk, and your visuals were just amazing. Where you got those photographs, I'm not sure. But I remember growing up in the 50s that friends of mine would take me to their father. It was usually always the father who had a shortwave radio. and communicated with I don't know who. I know certainly with some war buddies, people that they had met in France. But I mean, how extensive was the what would you call it, the private shortwave communication, and did it interfere with, or was it interfered by the commercial stations?
That's amateur radio. That continues to be an operation today. I'm an amateur radio operator, as some of the people I see on this display of faces I know are. But it's not what it used to be. They were amateurs had certain small segments of the high frequency shortwave bands that they could use for transmitting messages among themselves. And so instead of just having a receiver as an individual would have, they also had a transmitter and a big antenna and could talk around the world. It's another fading technology for the most part. People are losing interest in it for the same reason. Is it used to be something fantastic to be able to talk across the country or around the world for free. Now with the internet and Skype and Zoom, it's not a big deal, and actually it's an expensive and not very comparatively easy way to communicate. As a hobby, it has been slowly fading, although there's still maybe about 500,000 licensed amateurs in the United States.
In the 50s or 60s, would it be a significant investment for an individual? Was it costly to set it up?
Very simple installations transmitting by Morse code were not too expensive. Powerful stations with big towers. I knew people who had invested small fortunes in operating really almost commercial-sized amateur stations, and it was much more popular and important in the 1950s before cell phones and the internet.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm curious about Bolinas. You mentioned that there was a station there, and that was for during the war, did you say?
No, it was co-opted by the government during the war, but it's a private communication station that primarily was for shore-to-ship transmission of messages for commercial shipping. And it's RCA Communications operated a number of these stations around the country in the 30s through the 80s and 90s. And KPH in Bolinas was one of those major stations. Most all of them in the country have since been disassembled, but KPH is the exception. It is it's now owned by the National Park Service. There are marine radio historians who volunteer and keep the site operating. I visited there a number of years ago. It's a huge site with dozens of transmitters. They had Morse code and teletype operation talking to ships and to Hawaii and other shore-based stations. You can go visit them. Open by appointment. Obviously, during the COVID situation, a lot of things that were normally open are now closed. But you can go up to Bolinas, make contact with the Marine Radio Historical Society, and get a tour of an amazing operation that most people never knew existed.
I think that's fascinating because Bolinas, was it chosen because it's strategically located with the shipping? Commercial shipping, or why Bolinas?
It's a good radio location because it's on the Pacific coast, a good place for launching radio signals, and it's also far away from any city that would generate electrical interference. It's a radio quiet zone.
Thank you, and that's fascinating. I will make an attempt to go there. Thank you.
Look it up online about KPH. And the Marine Radio Historical Society. You'll see that there's really quite a huge operation and a lot of people that volunteer to keep that place operating.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a question from Peter. Peter said, can you say again why the original stations chose to broadcast to Latin America and Asia, but not to the U.S.? Were AM stations covering the U.S.?
Yes. Shortwave for domestic coverage is not the best way to transmit programming. The signals are often scratchy and they fade in and out. AM radio was used for domestic broadcasting, and shortwave was specifically targeted as a way to reach outside the U.S. Also, up until recently, government laws prohibited shortwave stations in the United States from broadcasting to its own citizens. They were only allowed to broadcast overseas. That rule has recently been relaxed, and now on shortwave you can hear about 4 or 5 commercial shortwave operations that are broadcasting primarily to citizens in the United States.
From Stephen, what, if any, artifacts of the original radio station equipment site exists on Treasure Island? Maybe
nothing.
Yeah, nothing.
Yeah, it was completely disassembled after the fair. The building is gone. Certainly, it was turned into a military base, and so very little of the fair remains, as I understand it.
Yes, but one of the functions of Naval Station Treasure Island has been personnel training, and they had a radio training program on the naval station for some time.
One thing I didn't cover in this discussion, but there was another radio operation during the fair that was radio studios that were built out separate from the General Electric operation, and those facilities were available to any broadcaster to lease and do remote broadcast back to their station. So a number of San Francisco stations broadcast programs from that studio in the fair, and network radio programs originated from there for the fair. As I understand it, it was a large studio that allowed audience participation. I've never seen photos of it or much information about it, but I know it existed.
Lisa, you had another question?
I'm going to fumble this a bit, but my understanding is that one of the opening ceremonies of the fair was a signal that was set off in India and traveled around the world to initiate something at the fair. And I wonder, I don't know what the technology of that was. Do you know about that? I mean, could that have been through shortwave radio?
It could have been. I know of General Electric at one point broadcast a program that was originated in Schenectady, transmitted on shortwave, was relayed by different stations, and the signal went all the way around the world and was finally received back again in Schenectady and rebroadcast.
Yeah, okay.
So that was a radio signal that went around the world and received back at its source.
I have one more question from Paul. He says, maybe we should keep a robust shortwave network up and running for the time coming. Seems almost inevitable. When the internet crashes, sunspots, digital war, terrorism, is there government awareness out there?
The issue is funding. The budgets for the Voice of America and similar operations keep getting cut back by Congress because of other priorities. The Voice of America today is a shadow of its former self, and the budget has been cut to the bone. So it would be a good idea, but there doesn't seem to be the political will to put the money into it. I think if there truly was a national emergency where the internet went down and communications was shut off, the best remaining means of communication would be what remains of amateur radio. 500,000 radio operators in the United States, many of whom have complete transmitting operations in their home. After Hurricane Katrina, for several days, amateur radio was the only way to communicate with the city of New Orleans. So I think as long as amateur radio continues to exist, that will be our emergency communications backbone.
Well, again, thank you, John. That was a wonderful lecture. Hope to see you in another month. Thanks for coming.